Thank you all for being here and for giving me an opportunity to speak about something that I actually rarely get a chance to talk about on this campus. As our Chancellor said, we've got an increasingly large sleep and performance research center here on campus with lots of other collaborators that are listed here. These are just the faculty. We've been growing quite a bit. And usually when I talk in settings like this or at conferences, I talk about the basic sleep research that I do with my colleagues here, or in collaboration or in parallel with them. And I'll touch upon that very briefly in my next slide, but you'll quickly understand that kind of stuff, that hardcore sleep research, what goes on in the brain when we're sleeping, why do we sleep, and that stuff that interests us so much around here, really doesn't get me very far when I'm in an operational setting talking to people that are just tired and want to have a solution. I'm going to be very brief about this because Brian, you already touched upon it, how the Sleep and Performance Research Center came to be. George and Advocate, we're very pleased that I'm very pleased that I have a chance to talk about some of the work that came from the investment that you helped us put together here. I said I would talk a little bit about numbers. This is funding that I was given the opportunity to bring in here over the now 7 years that I've been on this campus. And I split it up in what I call basic laboratory research and technology development. So that's the stuff that goes on in a human sleep lab. You saw some pictures on the previous slide of that, as well as development of tools, most of which are, at least from where I stand, involving mathematical modeling for predicting of fatigue in the operational settings. And I'll talk a little bit about that part. But as you can see, increasingly there is a component of applied research in the field that I've been able to add to my portfolio, and that's really where we take that work from the lab, that understanding we have about sleep and fatigue, and the technology tools that we developed into the operational setting, and say, let's see what we can do with that stuff for people that really want to be helped because they can't sleep or because they're fatigued, oftentimes not because of their own fault, but because of their work demanding them to work night shifts or extended work hours or travel across time zones for international travel and so on, and they are just simply fatigued, and they want to know, what can I do about it? And of course, the work that we do here on this campus, one of the main purposes of that is to make sure that we have an answer. And that answer is not necessarily simple, but we're working on it, and I'll try to sketch out a little bit today what we can and cannot do in that regard. I learned that when I put this slide together last week, that I just broke the $10 million mark of funding that I was able to bring in by myself. My colleagues, of course, have brought in much more. So when you said $20 million, I think that's the lowest estimate we can come up with. We're probably somewhere closer to 30 right now. Putting in $4.5 million, giving us somewhere between 20 and $30 million. Do I have to explain the concept of return on investment? I think we're doing fine there. So, I mean, in that sense, this has been a really a good success story. And my only concern right now is that how am I going to keep continuing that line without getting overburdened? I'm saying that tongue-in-cheek, but I do want to acknowledge really quickly before I forget Judith, my wife, who's here in the audience, who has to put up with all that work that I have to put into this research, and who's been incredibly supportive for my career, and I'm incredibly grateful for them. I said I would touch upon very briefly on the basic research that I do with my colleagues. And so here, this is work that I've been doing with Jim Kruger, is a simplified theory of the regulation of sleep and performance. And do I need to explain to you that I have absolutely no chance of explaining this to anybody outside of my smaller group of colleagues here? And I'm not even going to try to explain it to you right now either, because I've been told that I only have half an hour to talk, and I'm already 5 minutes into it. But fortunately, this very complex neurobiology of the regulation of sleep, wakefulness, and performance through the brain, of which we have learned so much from the work that Jim and his colleagues have put together, can be simplified into something that I can actually explain in the real world. Because it turns out that all this complex biology can be summarized by two main processes, two main biological processes that take place in the brain and by and large determine our overall ability to perform and our overall levels of fatigue in the operational settings. And those two processes are a circadian rhythm or a biological clock, simply a portion of the brain that keeps track of time of day, tells the brain whether it's night or day, and what does it do for the brain? It produces a pressure for wakefulness and alertness during the daytime when we're supposed to be active, and then withdraws that drive for wakefulness during the night, basically saying this would be a really good time to sleep. What do we do in the real world? We continuously ignore that signal, which is where our problems come from. And then there's another system that it works in collaboration with, or in synchrony with, which is called the homeostatic process. I indicated here with these little triangles here, and I can do that because by and large what this process does is it increases the pressure for sleep the longer you're awake. So with every hour that you're awake, there's a buildup of a pressure for sleep, a cost that you pay for being awake, that needs to be paid off, and then when you sleep, that pressure actually basically is dissipated again. You lose that pressure, and that's how you balance out sleep and wakefulness. That system's purpose is to make sure that if we're spending more time awake, that we expend a proper amount of sleep to make up for the difference. Now, these two processes work in beautiful synchrony in the brain. So when we wake up in the morning, the homeostatic pressure for sleep starts to increase. At the same time, the circadian pressure for wakefulness from the biological clock also starts to increase, and they balance each other out, giving us a beautiful, stable level of alertness from roughly, on my clock, 9 o'clock in the morning, we'll get there, to about somewhere late in the evening. But then at the end of the day, that circadian clock will withdraw that drive for wakefulness, and that is the signal for the body to, and for the brain mainly, I should say, to fall asleep and to pay off that pressure for sleep from the homeostatic pressure. Okay, at that point, as soon as you fall asleep, that homeostatic pressure for sleep is then dissipated. At the same time, the biological clock will continue to withdraw its drive for wakefulness. Again, the two processes balance each other out very nicely, giving us a nicely consolidated period of sleep, which ends in the morning when the biological clock starts to drive that wakefulness again, and then we spontaneously wake up. The story that I just told you is a perfectly beautiful story we see play out in the lab, and we almost never see it in the real world, because who ever has a chance to live on a schedule like that? Almost nobody anymore. And so what happens in a night shift worker, for instance? Well, the night shift worker faces the same two biological processes. It works exactly the same way, but here's how it plays out. Night shift worker goes to work in the evening hours or in the early night hours, assuming that he or she had some proper amount of sleep and just woke up, say, in the late afternoon or so. With every hour of wakefulness, now that the pressure for sleep starts to build up, and the circadian rhythm is still towards the evening is also still producing its drive for wakefulness. So those first couple of hours are okay. But then, during the night shift, the circadian drive for wakefulness is withdrawn. At the same time, because the person is awake, the pressure for sleep continues to build up. And now these two processes do not work together anymore. They work against each other. You become more sleepy, you become less awake. The net result is that the longer you're in that shift, the more fatigued you get. If that's not enough of a problem, then of course the worst time that you're going to be hit by this is on the commute home. And so one of the things we see in shift workers is that they have increased risk of accidents in the commute home, because that's when those two processes are at their worst possible interaction. But it gets worse yet, because then the night shift worker tries to sleep during the day, because that's where he or she has to sleep. And that's when the circadian drive for wakefulness is the highest. So that sleep is actually also prematurely terminated because of the pressure for wakefulness, and therefore a night shift worker is not only faced with working at the wrong time of day, but also sleeping at the wrong time of day, which is not a time conducive for sleep, and therefore building up a sleep debt. And so with these simple two biological components that work so well in a person who lives a normal daytime schedule, we get these major problems in people who work extended hours and night shifts. So simple, right? Until I try to explain that in an operational setting, and then people say, yeah, that's all great and wonderful, and we get it, but you don't know nothing about our operational settings, and there's all much this other stuff going on, and fatigue is just one component of a much more complex picture. And they're absolutely right. Because what I'm concerned about, as are people that I talk to in operational settings, is the relative risk of errors, incidents, and accidents. I want to know not so much how fatigued are you, but what are the consequences of that for the operational setting or for you personally? Are you going to make errors? Are you going to make incidents? Are you going to make accidents? Are you going to hurt yourself? Are you going to hurt other people? In other words, basically broadly termed safety, essentially. And that depends definitely on this biology that I described to you, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But there's also these many other factors that I have to take into account. This is a slide I presented at the Office of Naval Research last week. And so we have all these other factors in the operational environment, and what the ones that they talk about, for instance, are the weather, the sea state, how high are the waves, but also other stuff like distractions, illness on board, the work demands, all these other factors that are not necessarily that biology of sleep and wakefulness, but nevertheless come to the workplace and determine the overall picture of the chances of the risk of errors, incidents, and accidents. And some of these factors, unfortunately, interact with that biology. So no matter how simple it was when I just explained it to you, in the operational setting, it always becomes more complicated again. And that leads to a whole new line of research of how do all these factors interact with each other. Light's a particularly interesting one. It has 3 different functions. Light changes the synchronization of the biological clock and trains the circadian rhythm. In other words, it determines how we are aligned with our biological clock relative to day and night. It also has a very acute alerting effect, which means that if you're in bright light, if you step into the bright sunlight, it's a little challenging at the moment. But if you were to do that, I went to Florida yesterday very quickly, and I thought I was going to catch some sun, and then it rained on me. It was really, really depressing. That acute effect of alertness you get from standing in sunlight is actually a real effect on the brain. It's transient, but you get some benefit from light, from just being in a bright light environment. And there's an important third effect of light on safety in the occupational settings that most of my colleagues, it's so obvious most of my colleagues never think about it. When it's dark, it's very difficult to see what you're doing. So 3 factors that one single phenomenon, light, plays a role in this picture. So it gets rather complicated very quickly, even in operational setting. And I haven't even talked much about the aspects of sleep and sleep regulation yet. But there is something important that sort of binds all these factors, and that is the duty hours, the timing and the duration of the work hours in the operational setting. They determine the alignment and the flow of that biology. They determine our access to light. They determine all these other environmental factors one way or another, and they combine to produce that overall risk of errors, incidents, and accidents. And of course, what my job is to come up with countermeasures to make sure that risk is kept in check. Now, there is a real difficult aspect of the biology of fatigue, and that is that the effect of fatigue on the brain is a source of instability, which becomes worse the longer you're on the task. I want to show that to you very quickly so you get a sense of what that's like. And we can actually measure that in the lab, and this is one of the places where the lab research and the field research come together. This is a simple reaction time task, a 10-minute reaction time task called the psychomotor vigilance task. All you do is you look at this little red screen here. At some point, a stimulus pops up, which is a millisecond counter, and which starts counting at 0, and then every millisecond starts to increase by 1. And so very rapidly, you'll see high numbers appear on that screen. Your job is to press a button as soon as you see the counter and stop that counter, which then shows your reaction time in milliseconds. Now, if you're a healthy young individual who's not sleep deprived, you can do this task. It's actually rather complicated for reasons that are not entirely clear. It's very hard to maintain your attention on this task, and we don't really know what goes wrong in the brain that makes that so hard. But I think there's a Nobel Prize in the answer to that question somewhere. Graduate students, are you listening? But a healthy young individual who's not sleep deprived can do this task very consistently with reaction times. These are raw data of about 200 to 250 milliseconds consistently with every button pressed that they produce. This is across the 10 minutes. You get into the just a little bit more than 70 reaction times in there, and all those reaction times are very stably 200 to 250 milliseconds on this task, with just a few very minor hiccups here where we get to 300, 400 milliseconds, but nothing really special. Stable, alert, sustained attention performance. That's what that looks like. Now keep the same person awake for 24 hours, same time of day, but now 36 hours awake total. And what we see is that, interestingly enough, most of these reaction times are precisely the same as over here. The sleep-deprived brain is not an incapacitated brain per se. However, it is an unstable brain, because look at this one here. This is a reaction time of over 2 seconds. All of a sudden, coming out of nowhere with no prior warning and no after effect, there is a lapse of attention, just sitting there. Now, I know this is raw data from one person, but if we look at the graphs of other people, we see this phenomenon over and over again, these isolated lapses of attention coming out of nowhere that are a signal that the brain is not fully functional, it is unstable. These little gaps here are full starts, that is just people trying to press the button just in case something would come up. Yeah, you're laughing, but when I see those, I'm actually very happy because it means that people didn't just bag it. They didn't just like, oh my God, that task again. They're still trying. They're still trying to do it. You just can't. And then 24 hours later again, now this gets a little bit more deteriorated, right? So now we have lots of lapses. We actually have some frank sleep attacks, people literally falling asleep at the console. After 30 seconds, the task says beep and wakes you up again. But even there, some of the reaction times are still normal. So again, a sleep-deprived brain is an unstable brain. And that is what makes it dangerous in an operational setting, because most of the time, a sleep-deprived brain can do their job just fine. And therefore, just like the stock market, past performance is not a predictor of future performance. If you've been doing this fine for 30 years and you are driving home on a commuting home at the end of your shift, but the timing just works out so unfortunate that just this one lapse now coincides with when you're crossing an intersection. That's where the difference is between 30 years of accident-free driving and a fatal crash. And the fatal crash, I'm actually, it's not a funny concept, but it's an interesting phenomenon that's what the outcome of the instability of the brain is oftentimes that in incidents and accidents go completely unnoticed or without consequence for long periods of time, but then when all the factors line up, and one lapse of attention is the last sort of slice in the Swiss cheese, the holes of which the holes are lining up. This is Reason's Swiss cheese model of accident causation that says that an accident really only happens when many multiple factors line up just at the wrong time in the wrong way. And that lapse of attention is just that last factor that lines up the wrong way. Now all of a sudden you have what was completely harmless for years and years becomes a major incident or accident. And if you need a reminder of how catastrophic they can be, think Chernobyl or think the Challenger accident, where sleep deprivation was one of the factors that lined up in the wrong way at the wrong time. So now that I've told you that, and I do this with people that work in operational settings a lot too, now I have your attention because now it's serious. And so now the question comes up, well, what can we do about it? But before I get to that point, people will say, yeah, that's all nice and well, what you just told me, but that's a laboratory task, and I don't do reaction time tasks in my work. I do real work. I do real stuff. And what does it have anything to do with what you're talking about? Well, let me give you an example. That instability in the brain actually translates to instability in performance too, and there's a beautiful task that I can demonstrate that. It's called driving. And that instability in the brain is associated with a variability in how well we can maintain our position in the lane. And the more instability I have, the more lane deviation I get. And it turns out that lane deviation in driving is beautifully predicted by that same reaction time task that shows these instability phenomena. Here is data from an actual experiment we ran in the sleep lab. This is a study I did with Greg Belenky. And we looked at two groups at the request of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, one of the agencies in the Department of Transportation. We looked at two groups, a group of people who pretended to be daytime drivers, and then a group of people who pretended to be nighttime drivers. And we made use of the high-fidelity simulators that Brian Vila has in the simulation lab that's right next to my lab, and that is connected with mine to be an integrated state-of-the-art facility, of which there's only one in the world. We have the ability to do this kind of research here. And we had people drive in the lab for 14 days. We locked them up, basically closed the door, threw away the key. Well, that's not entirely true. We kept the key. But had them in the lab for 14 days, completely at our disposal and under our control. So we could dictate their schedules. And we said, you're going to be a daytime driver and you're going to be a nighttime driver. And now we're going to be having you drive this simulator 4 times a day for half an hour across all those days in the lab. And out of those 14 days, we're going to just designate 5 work days. And then we'll have a break, which truck drivers get to have at that point. It's called a 34-hour restart break. That's the time that they need to spend at home or at least not driving to recuperate. And then another 5 days in the lab for like a work cycle. So 2 duty cycles and an intervening restart break. And in the daytime drivers, what we saw was just like when you break in a new car, they became increasingly good at driving this car very stable. Their lane deviation, a measure of their variability in how well they could maintain the lane, position, decreased somewhat, and then they had this restart break and it kept decreasing. Now the nighttime drivers, the people we designated to work at night, didn't do so well on the task. They had more lane deviation, more variability, more difficulty maintaining a steady path right from the get-go. That's because they were working at night. But what the interesting finding was that after this restart break that was supposed to help them recuperate, they didn't get that same advantage. They stagnated. They didn't get any better on this task. And so they didn't actually get the benefit that people had hoped they would get out of that 34-hour restart break. Now, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration knew this. They were looking at, we asked us to look at this because they suspected that this might not be as effective in nighttime workers. And the reason for that is that these nighttime workers doing this restart break, just like people in the real world will do, were told by us to go back to a daytime schedule, to meet up with family and friends. Not that they had any in the lab, but and they weren't allowed in, but but to do what normal people do on the weekend or when they're off of work, they go back to a daytime schedule. And that then hurts them. It's not helpful in recuperation anymore, and things get worse. You look at time, you collapse these data and you split them out over time of day. You see that the daytime drivers who start driving in the morning keep a steady schedule all the way through the late afternoon, evening. The nighttime drivers, just as I told you that biology would predict us, start out just about the same, but then through the night they get worse and worse and worse. And in the early morning hours, when they enter early morning traffic, that's when they're at their worst possible. So the same, that biology works out beautifully here that I described to you. But what we learned is that restart break, here we see the same phenomenon here. The daytime drivers get much better after the restart break, but the nighttime drivers don't have that same benefit. They didn't recuperate as much. And there's a cost to all that too. There's actually a cost and difference in fuel use. The simulator is so real-world realistic that it actually calculates how much fuel you're using. And there's a 1% increase in fuel use when you start to have problems maintaining your lane position. At today's oil prices, that's actually not insignificant. Now, this study was called the, I have to read this, I can't even pronounce it. Investigation into motor carrier practices to achieve optimal CMV driver performance. That's commercial motor vehicle drivers, phase 1. And the reason that I'm pointing this out is that this summer, this section appeared in a bill that was passed by Congress. This must have been the only one that they passed this session, called Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century. Nobody could tell me what that means, but it's called MAP 21. It's a reauthorization bill. It was signed into law on July 6, 2012, and it tells the Secretary of the Department of Transportation to do a field study to replicate the findings of, and literally here is the title of that study that we did. So if you're asking yourself, does this work actually really mean anything in practice? Well, two things. First of all, the reason this appeared in this bill is because when we published the results of the study that I just presented to you, they actually changed the law for truck drivers and said, well, if you're a nighttime driver, you probably need more time off. You probably need an additional night in that 34-hour restart break, making it a little bit longer of a restart break. And secondly, well, as soon as they did that, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration found themselves in court because, of course, there's a cost to the industry of doing that. And they were then told to look into this to see if this actually translates into real world and real truck drivers driving real trucks on real roads. We're going to do that study through the next year. Ken, I don't know, Ken, if you're asking yourself, why am I traveling so crazily much? That's because that field research actually happens somewhere in the United States, but not here. So that's why I'm on a plane all the time these days. I want to take you to another example that is related to this. This is from the aviation environment. So I already mentioned that we have these two biological processes and we can capture those into mathematical equations. That's the technology development that I do. Here's actually a screenshot of an app that we developed that is on my phone. It's on my phone only. It's a very exclusive app, but we have it. Where you can actually run predictions of what your fatigue levels would look like if you have particular schedules. I know you can. It's very difficult to see this from a distance, but just to show you very quickly, this orange line here is a schedule with perfect 8-hour sleep every night, and here this yellow schedule is what you do if you were to stay up for 3 days. I don't think that's a brilliant idea. I don't think why you would need the app for that, but that's the only way I could make it so that you could see it from the back. So you can actually compare two schedules here. And that is a technology development that we've been spearheading, where we use mathematical equations to say, look at two different possible work schedules and see which one is the most fatiguing and which one is the most strategically advantageous in your operational setting to make happen, so that you can get the job done, so that the integrity of your operational setting is preserved, but at the same time you try to reduce fatigue. And it turns out, of course, there's a lot of leeway in how you can put together schedules, provided you can get the regulations that the federal government puts on us out of the way, because as well-intentioned as they are actually making it more difficult. I'll show you an example of how we used that work. This is work we did about 3 years ago, when there was a notice of proposed rulemaking came out for aviation to change the duty hours for pilots. This was much needed regulation, and very enlightened, actually. The Federal Aviation Administration decided that the hours that pilots can fly should depend not only on how long they fly, but also on what time of day they start, because nighttime flying is obviously much more fatiguing, for all the obvious reasons that you now know, than daytime flying. But in their eternal wisdom, they also decided that the number of segments you fly, the number of trips that you do on a day, should also make a difference, because it must be more fatiguing, so was their argument, to fly multiple trips on a day, multiple short hops or segments, than to do one long-haul flight from one side of the country to another. Sounds brilliant, and everybody was in agreement that this was much needed, but there is absolutely no science to support that. And there was only one data set in the entire world that ever spoke to the issue of workload as a component in fatigue. And I sat on it, I still sit on it, it's still not published, and I'm very deeply ashamed, because I've had it for 8 years now. But I've put it to good use, though, because we decided to take that workload data and to adapt this model to allow for also predictions of what is the cost of additional work for your levels of fatigue. Because if this reasoning is correct, that the number of segments you fly determines how fatigued you are, then we must be able to produce some science that says that how much more fatigue do you actually get from an additional workload. And so I got a call from the Regional Airlines Association. They basically put this problem in front of me, said this is what the Federal Aviation Administration has decided, and we want to respond to that because we think it's going to hurt our industry, because they're going to make it more difficult for us to have an early start and then fly commuters to the rest of the world or to other places in the US. And therefore, not only are we hurting our industry, but also our customer base, the people that want to go just to the nearest city to go to work and back, are going to be hurt by us being able to no longer provide the same service. Can you look into this? And the argument, there was an actual debate that they had. There was an aviation rule-making committee had been put together by the FAA to come up with recommendations, and then when the FAA finally put out its proposed rule, it was different. And they had changed the table that the ARC, the Aviation Rule-Making Committee, had proposed. And they had made all the flight times shorter for early starts in this block from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. Exactly the time when the commuter airlines really start to fly people to their destinations. So they asked us, can you give us an answer to this question? Who's right, the ARC or the FAA? So I'm like, yeah, sure. I'll have it for you in about 2 years. And they was like, no, we need it next month, because we're supposed to respond to that rule. It's like, okay, funny. I don't think I can do that. However, that, of course, is not an option. In operational settings, the fact is, sorry, can you wait for a couple of years, is really not an option. So we had to come up with a different solution. And so what we did is we took this model, we changed it to account for workload, we applied it and said, listen, this is where we think it plays out. We think the Aviation Rulemaking Committee is actually right. The flight times for early starts can be longer because you fly into the afternoon, and the afternoon is where your drive for circadian wakefulness is the highest. So you'll be safe in that zone. That's actually called the wake maintenance zone in my field, because it is so hard to fall asleep during that time. So if you fly into the afternoon, even if you had an early morning start, it's not going to make your operation any less safe. That should be okay. But that's a projection based on a model, and we have no data to actually support that. So you have to promise us that if we do this, that we're also going to collect the data after the fact to make sure that at least what we said was actually right. Well, it turned out that the FAA took our recommendations. They changed the rules back to what the Aviation Rulemaking Committee had actually proposed. So they give the industry some leeway in flying the schedules that they wanted to fly. And they also kept their promise and allowed us to do the study to collect the data to actually show what the effects of our workload are. So we did a study in a simulator with real pilots flying real flights in a real simulated environment so that it's safe, and our full control with performance testing and all those things. I presented the results of that study to the board of directors of the Regional Airline Association yesterday when I was in Fort Lauderdale. I had hoped that I would be able to talk about that today, but these data are so valuable to them that I was told to actually wait until they had a chance to release that news themselves. So I can't. But suffice it to say, I will say this much: what we had projected actually came out to be true, was supported by the data. So we are again making a real impact in operational settings there. This is for the benefit of those of you who are involved in setting up a medical campus here. Fatigue has an impact on residents. That's been in the news for a long time, so I don't really tell you anything new that you don't already know. But what most people don't know is that if you use the models, the equations that we have put together to describe that biology, if you play those out in different possible scenarios, there is this idea that if you give people overall the same amount of time in bed, that over a week that it evens out, that it doesn't really matter how you distribute it. So there are many different schedules that residents can have. They're rather complicated. House staff here in Spokane can have 5 hours sleep on Monday through Saturday and 8 hours for sleep on Sunday. There's an elective 1 schedule that has no sleep every 4th day, so you're on a night shift period there. Then 10 hours sleep on the day after. This is really complicated. I don't know how to do it. 5 hours sleep on other weekdays or 8 hours sleep on other weekend days. And then there's elective 2 schedule that has 4 hours of sleep on Monday and Friday and 9 hours for sleep during the weekend. And it turns out that if you actually calculate this, that over the year you get the same amount of sleep in every one of these schedules. And the belief has always been that therefore that's all equal and therefore everybody should be fine. Or equally fatigued, depending on how you look at it. But that is actually not true. Because schedules that have periods in them where you don't get enough sleep, less than about 4 hours or total sleep deprivation, like this elective 1 schedule, during those periods you accelerate the buildup of your fatigue much more than if you're just sleep restricted like most of us are. And you can see that here in this elective 1 schedule with the peaks here. Those are the days when people stay up the whole night. They actually start out better because they get a little bit more sleep and because they know they're going to lose it later. But as you see with every cycle that you do this, that schedule that started out better actually starts to get worse. And if you project this out over time, the elective 1 schedule will actually come out much worse. And these people build up a cumulative fatigue. And so these schedules are not equivalent and not all the same. And you cannot really predict a priori which one's going to be better, but that's where these mathematical models, these tools that we developed, come in. Here's another example of that. I'm wrapping up. This is a similar model applied to train operations. This is not the model that we have here at WSU. This is a model of a colleague of mine, Steve Hirsch, called the safety model. And on this axis here, you see the time that you spend at a percentage of effectiveness, where this anchors 100% effectiveness. Everybody is always at 100% effectiveness or less, by definition. Very few times people are at less than 50% effectiveness. But if you're at this point here, that says how many hours of the day are you spending at 85% effectiveness or less? Otherwise, in other words, how many hours of the day are you spending at a fatigue level that is suboptimal at 85% or worse? And there's 3 shifts in railroad dispatchers: the first and second and the third shift, which are basically the morning, the afternoon, and the night shift. And what you can see here is that the people in the night shift, that's this curve over here, spend much more time at 85% effectiveness or less, or also much more time at 90% effectiveness or less. Or if I drew the line over here, they spend much more time at 70% effectiveness or less. In other words, no matter what level I set as acceptable performance, the night shift workers are always spending more time below that level. There's a big debate in my field about where you should draw this line. But you will quickly notice, if you draw it this way, that it doesn't matter where I draw the line. The night shift workers are always the ones that are worst off. Why is this important? If you want to invest in fatigue management strategies, in ways to optimize your schedules, you want to invest in this group, because that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. And that is the number one question that I get in operational environments. It's not, everybody gets it. Fatigue is bad. We need to fix it. What's it going to cost me? How do I have return on investment? This kind of reasoning and this kind of work gives you an answer to that. And it turns out that in certain operations, in many operations, spending some effort and time into managing fatigue is actually profitable. But that can only be seen in the context of all these other factors that also make the operational environment. And so that's where I spend most of my time trying to figure out how do all these factors interconnect and where does the money flow. So we have a patent here at WSU. We've got a couple in this area, pending. This one is about to be awarded, I think. This is hopeful, but it looks like it will be. Of taking that idea and putting it into the operational environment and say, if we know something about fatigue and we know something about the cost of fatigue, we can calculate it. And we, of course, know the other cost factors in the operational setting because companies routinely do that. They know their logistical things very well. They know what it costs to have personnel, to have backup personnel, to have resources available, to have some schedule redundancy, to have the right people with the right qualifications, the right training programs. They know what all that stuff costs. If we can add a cost also to managing fatigue, which we now increasingly can, then what we can say is treat fatigue as just one other source of your logistical, one other item of your logistical operation, put it in a mix and optimize your schedules so that not only are you most profitable, so that all your personnel is there, so that all your resources are there, but also that they are minimally fatigued. And those things are not always compatible, but oftentimes it turns out that they are. And especially if you then do this exercise and you take away the rules that are imposed by the federal government on duty hours and those that may have been negotiated in collective bargaining agreements, all to the benefit of the people and making sure that they're not fatigued. If you ignore all those rules, you come up with schedules that are both more productive, more profitable, and less fatiguing, and therefore better for the well-being of the workers. And so that is where my field is going, at least in operational settings, is trying to make sure that we can manage fatigue in a way that maintains operational integrity, and at the end of the day makes everything better for both labor and management, for both the regulator and the public, makes things safer, better well-being, same or better bottom line, and same operational integrity. That's the holy grail of what I'm doing in the field. What I need to do at Lasting is acknowledge a lot of people that have allowed me to do this work. Here's my team in the sleep lab. They keep the place operational and running when I'm not there. That's most of the time these days. These are my key collaborators outside of the Sleep and Performance Research Center. Some at WSU, very productive collaborations. I have here many other places in the US and even outside of the US. And these are all my funding agencies. And as you can see, I've accumulated quite a few. That's what it takes to keep an operation like a lab like mine running. This diverse portfolio, which is, again, it's just like the stock market. If one goes down, at least the other ones keep you running. That's what it takes to manage that. But I have been incredibly fortunate that all these agencies have put their trust in my work, and my collaborators have stuck with me, and particularly that I have such a fabulous team here at WSU that keeps the place going when I'm away. Thank you very much.